Living on a ranch has its challenges, but I've always loved its simplicity. The early mornings, the sounds of the animals, and the endless sky stretching over acres of open land, it was my slice of peace. That's why the footprints caught me so off guard. It began one morning in early spring. I stepped out of the house, coffee mug in hand, heading toward the livestock pen to check on the goats. Overnight rain had softened the dirt, leaving behind a canvas of perfect impressions, hooves, and something else. Human footprints. Large ones, the kind you'd expect from a grown man wearing heavy boots. At first, I thought maybe one of the farmhands had come by late, but that didn't add up. None of them had any reason to be here after hours, especially near the pen. These prints didn't lead to the barn or the fields. Instead, they circled the livestock pen in strange loops, then veered toward my front porch before disappearing into the woods. I brushed it off that day. Ranch life isn't glamorous, odd things happen. Maybe it was a hunter who wandered onto the property or a prank by the neighbor's kid. Still, the image of those footprints lingered in the back of my mind. The next morning, I found fresh footprints. The same size, the same pattern circling the pen, pausing at the porch, then vanishing into the woods. My stomach tightened. This wasn't random. Someone was deliberately walking around my property in the dead of night. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow them. I grabbed a jacket, laced up my boots, and started tracing the tracks. The trail led deep into the woods, farther than I usually ventured. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of my boots on damp leaves. About 100 yards in, the tracks turned sharply toward the road and disappeared. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the trail ended. It didn't make sense. Whoever this was, they were careful, deliberate in how they moved. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions. Who was coming onto my property? Why were they watching? And more importantly, what were they planning? After a week of this, I'd had enough. Whoever it was, they were testing boundaries, and I wasn't about to let it continue. I grabbed my shotgun, a thermos of coffee, and a blanket, and holed up in the barn. From there, I had a clear view of the livestock pen and the houses. The hours dragged on, and the cold seeped through the blanket. Just after midnight, the silence was broken by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. My pulse quickened as I peered through the barn slats. A figure emerged from the tree line, moving deliberately toward the pen. They were tall, dressed in dark clothing. As they paused by the pen, I noticed something else, a second figure lurking at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the shadows. A cold wave of fear washed over me. Two of them. This wasn't just trespassing, it was deliberate. My grip tightened on the shotgun. Without hesitation, I fired 2 warning shots into the air. The sound shattered the stillness, and the figure by the pen froze. For a moment, I thought they would retreat, but then a loud crack echoed through the night. A bullet slammed into the barn door, just feet from where I crouched. I ducked instinctively as another shot rang out, splinters flying from the wooden walls. My hands trembled as I crawled to the other side of the barn, pulling out my phone to dial 911. Whispering into the receiver, I explained the situation. "They're armed. Please send someone quickly." The dispatcher assured me officers were on their way, but out here in the middle of nowhere, I knew it would take time, too much time. Outside, the silence was oppressive. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. My heart pounded as I imagined them breaking in or worse. But moments later, the footsteps retreated, crunching away on the gravel. 40 agonizing minutes later, red and blue lights lit up the driveway. Relief washed over me as I ran out to meet the officers. They searched the property, but found only footprints and shell casings near the tree line. One officer speculated it might have been poachers or thieves, but their behavior didn't match. Why circle the pen for days before making a move? And what were they carrying when they left? Over the next few weeks, I installed floodlights and cameras around the property. The police promised to patrol more frequently, but out here, I knew better than to rely on that. Ranch life might seem peaceful, but it's anything but predictable. Still, the nights felt different. Every creak of the windmill or rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I found myself waking at odd hours, checking the cameras obsessively. The footprints never returned, but I'm not sure the same can be said for whoever left them. I've lived on this ranch for 10 years, and it's the first time I've felt genuinely unsafe. I used to love the isolation, the way the stars stretched endlessly over the horizon, unbroken by city lights. Now, that isolation feels like a vulnerability. The farm's deeper secrets, the unease didn't fade. About 2 weeks after the incident, I found something strange near the tree line. While checking the fences for damage, I spotted a torn piece of fabric caught on the barbed wire. It was dark green, like the jacket the figure near the pen had worn. I picked it up, feeling the coarse material between my fingers. There was something almost ritualistic about how the events had played out, the circling of the pen, the deliberate retreat into the woods. It wasn't random. A few days later, the cameras caught something. At around 3 a.m., one of the floodlights by the barn flickered, and for a brief moment, a figure was illuminated near the edge of the woods. They stood still, watching the house. I couldn't make out details, but their posture was unsettling rigid, almost inhuman. By the time I got outside, they were gone, leaving only the eerie glow of the floodlight swinging in the wind. I'm not sure what they wanted or if they'll return, but the memory of their presence lingers, a shadow that stretches across the peaceful life I once knew. Whatever they were after, I know one thing for certain. This ranch will never feel the same again. Isolation might seem peaceful, but out here, it's a double-edged sword. Peace isn't guaranteed, it's something you fight to protect. And I'll be ready if they come back. By the third night, my unease had grown into annoying dread. The farmhouse, with its rustic charm and sprawling isolation, felt like a trap. It was close to midnight, and I sat in the living room under the dim glow of a single lamp, a thick book in hand. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the old house seemed to breathe, its wooden frame groaning occasionally. The stillness was oppressive, amplifying every creak and rustle. That's when I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. I froze. My mind leaped to rational explanations. It's an old house, Izzy. The wood expands and contracts. But as the creaks turned rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps crossing the floor above me, my heart began to race. Jake? My voice broke the silence, trembling. Is that you? Nothing. The weight of the silence pressed down on me. Every instinct screamed to stay put, but curiosity or maybe foolishness pushed me to investigate. Gripping a flashlight, I approached the staircase. Each step groaned under my weight, and the beam of light wavered as my hands shook. At the top, the hallway stretched before me, the doors all closed except one. The guest bedroom door stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Steeling myself, I nudged the door open with the flashlight. The room looked undisturbed at first glance, exactly as Jake had left it. His suitcase lay by the dresser, a few shirts draped haphazardly over the back of a chair, but the bed was unmade. That struck me as odd. Jake was meticulous, the kind of person who folded hospital corners on every bed he touched. My pulse quickened as I noticed another detail: the closet door. It was ajar, just enough to reveal a shadowed interior. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and my mind raced through the worst possibilities. Someone could be hiding in there. My grip on the flashlight tightened. Summoning every ounce of courage, I lunged forward and flung the closet door wide open. Nothing, just clothes on hangers, a few dusty boxes, and an overwhelming wave of relief that made me laugh nervously at myself. But the laugh died in my throat as a draft brushed past me, chilling the sweat on my neck. The feeling of being watched lingered. I backed out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, and hurried downstairs, unable to shake the sensation. The following morning brought more unsettling discoveries. The latch on the barn door, sturdy and secure the day before, now dangled by a single nail, broken. Inside, the horses were restless, their ears twitching at every sound. Daisy, the calmest and most reliable of the lot, refused to leave her stall, her eyes wide with fear. I tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to coincidence or bad luck. But deep down, I knew better. Frustrated, I called Jake that evening. "Did you notice anything strange before you left?" I asked. "Footprints, missing tools. Anything at all?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "A few weeks ago, yeah," he admitted reluctantly. "Found some footprints near the barn, and some tools went missing. That's actually why I asked you to stay there. I figured having someone around would scare them off. You didn't think to tell me this before I agreed to house sit?" My voice rose with disbelief. "I didn't think it was a big deal," he said defensively. "Probably just kids messing around." "Kids don't break into barns and freak out horses, Jake." He sighed, but I cut the conversation short. Anger bubbled just beneath the surface. But more than that, I felt vulnerable. That night, I triple-checked every door and window, securing them as best I could. I wedged a chair under the kitchen doorknob for good measure and finally retreated to bed, hoping for an uneventful night. Sleep came reluctantly, and it didn't last long. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a dull thud against the side of the house. I sat up, heart pounding. Probably an animal, I thought, though the pit in my stomach said otherwise. When the sound came again, louder and more deliberate, I couldn't ignore it. Crossing the room cautiously, I peered out the window. Moonlight spilled across the yard, casting long shadows. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I saw it. A ladder propped against the side of the house, directly under my window. My breath caught. The glass was smudged with the faint imprint of a face, as if someone had pressed against it, watching me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. Grabbing the flashlight, I scanned the yard below. The ladder was empty, but the smudge on the window remained a chilling reminder of whoever had been there. The rest of the night passed in a haze of sleepless paranoia. Every creak and rustle sent my nerves into overdrive. When morning finally came, I found more evidence of intrusion. The back door was ajar, its lock damaged. The chair I'd wedged under the knob lay on its side. Someone had been inside the house. I called the police immediately. The dispatcher's calm voice was a lifeline as I described what had happened. They assured me help was on the way. While waiting, I armed myself with a kitchen knife and hid in the pantry. The door cracked just enough to watch the room. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, I heard it footsteps, deliberate and heavy, moving through the house. My grip on the knife tightened as a second set of footsteps joined the first. The sound of their boots crunching on the old wooden floor sent a jolt of fear coursing through me. I pressed myself further into the corner of the pantry, the cool metal of the knife trembling in my hand. Low voices murmured just beyond my comprehension. The words were muffled, but the tone carried an edge that chilled me to the bone. Who were they? What did they want? I held my breath, straining to make sense of the conversation. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay silent, but my heart thundered so loudly I feared they'd hear it. My fingers ached from clutching the knife so tightly. The footsteps drew closer. I could hear the creak of the floorboards under their weight, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed in the suffocating silence. They stopped just outside the pantry door. My breath hitched. This is it, I thought. They found me. The handle of the pantry door rattled. I froze, bracing myself for the worst. Time seemed to stretch unbearably, every second dragging on like an eternity. My mind raced through options. Should I scream? Should I charge at them? Should I do nothing? Before I could decide, a piercing siren shattered the suffocating tension. It blared through the still night, its high-pitched wail cutting through the air like a lifeline. The intruders cursed under their breath, their voices gruff and hurried. Their footsteps retreated in a scramble, fading into the distance as they fled. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, my muscles locked with fear. The siren seemed to grow louder, almost mocking me for my paralysis. Slowly, the weight of the knife in my hand brought me back to reality. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Blue and red lights painted the farmhouse in eerie flashes, turning the once peaceful scene into something out of a nightmare. Officers swarmed the property, their radios crackling as they assessed the situation. Inside, they found signs of forced entry, a broken lock on the back door and a muddy trail of footprints leading in from the fields. The trail continued through the houses, stopping at the pantry where I had hidden. Beyond that, it led out again, disappearing into the dense woods that bordered the farm. But the intruders themselves were gone. When Jake returned the next day, guilt was etched deeply into his face. He walked into the kitchen, his usually confident stride replaced with hesitant steps. He avoided my gaze, busying himself by setting down a bag of groceries. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and heavy. "I had a feeling something was going on, but I didn't want to worry you. I thought having someone here would scare them off." His words felt like a slap. My grip on the mug of coffee tightened as I stared at him, my heart twisting with anger and disbelief. "You used me as bait," I said, my voice trembling with rage. Jake looked up sharply, his face pale. "No, that's not. I didn't mean for." "You knew something was wrong," I interrupted, the words spilling out in a torrent. "And you left me here, alone, in the middle of nowhere. Do you have any idea what that was like?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked away, guilt written all over his face. I didn't wait for an explanation. The trust between us had shattered, splintering into pieces. I had no interest in putting back together. I packed my bags in silence, my hands shaking as I folded clothes and stuffed them into my suitcase. As I was about to leave, June, the elderly woman who helped with the farm chores, approached me. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her weathered hands clutched the edges of her shawl. "You're not the first to leave early," she said softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes darting around as if someone might overhear. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her gaze flitting toward the dark woods beyond the farmhouse. "Other workers have seen things, faces in windows, strange noises at night. It always happens." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. June shook her head, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. This land, it's not right. You can feel it if you stay long enough. I've told Jake to sell, but he won't listen. Says it's just old stories. Her words lingered in my mind long after I left. As I drove away, the memories of the past week replayed in my head like a horror film. The smudge on the window that morning, the ladder propped under my window the night before, the deliberate footsteps outside my door. All of it seemed to take on a new, sinister meaning. By the time I reached the safety of the city, I was certain of one thing: I would never set foot on that farm again. But the memories refused to fade. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without the light on. Every creak of my apartment's floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows sent my heart racing. I kept imagining those footsteps, deliberate and menacing, drawing closer and closer. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I decided to look up the history of the farm. What I found only deepened my unease. The farm had once belonged to a family named the Grays. In the early 1900s, they had vanished without a trace. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the woods and hearing strange noises at night, but no one could explain what had happened to the Grays. Over the years, the land had passed through several owners, all of whom left abruptly, citing unexplainable occurrences. My thoughts returned to June's words. This land, it's not right. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. The farm wasn't just a quiet, isolated piece of rural life. It was something darker, something I couldn't fully understand. And though I had escaped, a part of me felt like it hadn't let me go. Even now, as I write this, I can't shake the sensation of being watched. Sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. I tell myself it's just a neighbor, but deep down, I know better. Isolation can be comforting, a chance to escape the chaos of the world, but it can also be dangerous. Out there, surrounded by endless quiet and darkness, you're reminded of just how alone you really are. And sometimes, being alone is the scariest thing of all.